Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 267 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Sobalski, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. One of the clearest and most enduring legacies of the Middle Ages is the beautiful buildings left behind. In them, we can see tangible evidence of the incredible sophistication of imagination, measurement, and building techniques that characterize the medieval period, especially in the intricate constructions of the 12th century. Many of these buildings were, of course, devoted to God, using blueprints that no longer exist. But one of the most famous, and famously confusing, sets of architectural instructions was set out in the Bible itself, and one 12th century man was determined to create a detailed blueprint of it, Richard of Saint-Victor. This week, I spoke with Dr. Karl Kinsella about Richard of Saint-Victor and his visionary architectural drawings. Karl is a lecturer in art history at the University of Aberdeen and the author of many articles on medieval architecture, including one on hobbits' preference for round windows. His new book is God's Own Language, Architectural Drawing in the 12th Century. Our conversation on Richard's work, his efforts to make a biblical vision clear, and why it's such an important contribution to the history of architecture is coming up right after this. Well, thank you, Karl. It is a pleasure to meet you. And we've already been talking for like 15 minutes, but it's time to start talking about medieval architecture. Welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for the invite. Any opportunity to talk about medieval architecture, as anybody knows me, is always one I'll take. So thank you immensely.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Okay, so the medieval world has left us all sorts of amazing architecture. I need to ask first, who is coming up with these drawings? And where are they learning how to do that?
That's a great question. I mean, I deal with the 12th century for the most part. There's no architectural schools, even the idea of there being an architect. When we think of a person and that word, that doesn't really apply very well to the 12th century at all. And so there's some discussion as to whether there were architectural drawings in the 12th century beyond the sort of my work on the sort of theological drawings. I don't think I'm too out there to suggest that there probably were. I expect it's very difficult to build a building like Durham Cathedral without some sort of visual communication as to what it's going to look like or what the masons should do. But we just don't have them. They're not there. And we can see why. Maybe they were done on the ground. We know later on they're done in plaster, literally you see in New York Minster, on the floor, sort of inscribed into plaster. They're probably done on scrap bits of parchment and wax tablets. So all these very sort of ephemeral surfaces and medium that get destroyed very easily. So as a medievalist, then you have to sort of work very hard to try and recreate or try to reimagine those processes and see sort of the tip of the iceberg and the glimpses of it in surprising context. So who's making them? Probably a lot of people. But how do we know that? Well, we don't know for sure, unfortunately.
This is one of the tricks of medieval studies, right? Where you're like, my spidey sense is tingling. There's got to be something here, but I can't find it. So yeah. It's a question that I ask a lot on this podcast, like, where do we actually find this evidence? Because it can be in very strange places.
Yeah, and it's something I really enjoyed doing in my research is having an idea and looking for it in not very obvious sources. So my work is on Richard of Saint-Victor, and he creates these architectural drawings, these plans and elevations for a commentary on the book of Ezekiel, especially the latter part of Ezekiel from chapter 40 to 48. The prophet describes in great detail and confusing detail this temple complex situated on the top and the sides of a mountain. And Richard is sort of coming from background and thinking he's been told that it's not possible essentially to visualize this, and Richard disagrees quite strongly in fact. And he says, well, not only is it possible, but I've done it for you. So who's doing them? Well, Richard is doing them to make a point. It's a sort of the rhetorical power of architectural drawings that in this case seeing is believing. And there's clearly a framework for that we see similar examples in contemporary Jewish manuscripts and Islamic materials as well. And because more theological sources exist, maybe that's a good place to find examples of these rather than the sort of throwaway materials that I described before, which makes sense when you think about it.
Yes. Well, for people, I mean, we are talking about something that people can't actually see, which is kind of at the heart of your book anyway. But when we're talking about these drawings that Richard does, we should say kind of at the outset that these are what look like blueprints. They look like architectural drawings. They don't look like, a cartoon of a castle in the sky, right? So can you tell us a little bit about what we would see if we were looking at this book?
Yeah, so the thing that drew me to them originally was just how legible they are as plans and elevations. So, to give you an example, in the sort of intersections between all the different atria in this temple complex that Ezekiel describes, there's these gatehouses that are these sort of points of entry and egress. So, there's quite a number of them around the place, and Richard focuses on them, and he provides three plans and two elevations. So, the first plan shows half the building, or sorry, shows sort of very general sense of the entire building with a passageway running through it. And then the second drawing is a plan that shows half the building and then gives you some indication of the internal structure of it. So where the walls come across. And then the last plan is sort of that doubled up. So it shows you the whole building with the passageway through it and the internal structure on the ground floor. And then you turn a few pages in the manuscript copies and then suddenly, certainly in the earliest one, you're faced with a whole opening of the manuscript. And on one side is the front elevation that has the arches, has the doorway, has the crenellations. And then on the facing page, you have the lateral elevation, so from the side. And in fact, it's a sectional elevation. So he takes a slice through the ground floor and you can see into the building. And it's all before the advent of CAD drawing in architectural practice. These would be standard fare to the middle of the 20th century in the ways in which you render buildings. And because the fundamental question I always think about is how on earth do you represent a three-dimensional object on a two-dimensional surface? You just can't do it. It's like the uncertainty principle. It's not a lack of measurement. It's inherent within the action. And so you have to have caveats and you have to have a payoff. You have to make decisions about what you include or don't include. And those sorts of processes is what leads to a drawing such as Richard gives. And it just so happens he made very similar choices that we would make today in some ways.
Yeah, one of the things that's fascinating to me looking back at history, when you see an architectural drawing, which can be rare in the Middle Ages, like you're talking about, it is a bird's eye view, which is fascinating to me because how often do you get a bird's eye view in the Middle Ages? We don't have drones. So how is this happening? I think that's fascinating.
Me too. And it's not just in these anyway, it's not just they pretended they're floating above the building, because in a plan, you take a slice through it. It's essentially a section as well. You measure up a particular amount from the foundations and then you take everything above that off and you can see inside it. So it's not just a sort of bird's eye view, it's sort of a godlike view of a building because you can see almost everything, and not everything, because Richard complains about the plan format. And so he doesn't just give you the plan, he writes about it and go, well, here's the plan. And he calls it a plan, which is the first use of this term in reference to a drawing. And he says, here it is, except, you can't show the length, width, and height under the same figure in a plan. So he's sort of frustrated with the process too. And hence, probably one of the reasons you get elevations. And it's the first time we get this combination of plan and elevation, because there are some earlier versions of architectural drawings like the Sangol plan or something like that. But Richard's brilliance in many ways is the combination of drawings to give you a full picture of it. And I've sort of printed out parts of it, and you can build the general size of it in Lego if you're so inclined, and sort of glue the different parts onto to give a sense of the model as much as anything else. And it's not perfect, but it's a bloody good approximation of an actual building.
That's what I was thinking. Like, with the way you're describing Richard describing this, it sounds like he would be like, listen, I've made it out of marzipan. You can see it. It's right here.
Yeah, like my daughter, he said, I made it out of mashed potatoes and gravy, and
Yeah.
I'm just sort of, it makes sense, I swear. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so I need to walk us back a little bit in that he wants to create something that comes out of a vision in the Bible, Ezekiel's vision. Why bother with this at all? Why is this important? Why does he need to create this out of his mashed potatoes?
I'm not going to lose that image now, ever. It's a good question because we're lucky in that he tells us. It's one of those few sources where you think, you read and go, I wish they'd say this. But Richard's quite nice to his future readers. And he gives a couple of reasons. One is explicit in saying that, well, he includes the drawings so that everybody, no matter how simplex they are, can understand his argument. There's a piece of rhetoric because school children aren't reading, obscure commentaries on the book of Ezekiel, the whole book. So he's saying this to show that this makes sense, that it's, as said, it's visual rhetoric. But also, Richard is coming from the context of Saint-Victor on the left bank in Paris in the 12th century, as sort of Hugh of Saint-Victor's protege, probably in many ways. And for Hugh and Richard, it was very important to have a solid historical foundation for commentary. So you needed to know what the Bible actually says, what it refers to. And only on that foundation can you then, as Hugh says, build upon it and talk about allegory and morality and anything like that. And the problem is with Ezekiel, there's very few commentaries on Ezekiel before Richard's. The most famous for Richard would have been Gregory the Great. And Gregory, when it comes to the architectural vision, says, well, no, the description makes no sense. A door is described as wider than the wall to which it's attached. Well, that's a sure sign there's no historical foundation to this anyway. And it's right to just move on to the allegorical instead. But this, for Richard, this is a failure of understanding. This is not a failure of Ezekiel. It's a failure on the part of the exegete or the commentator on this. And he sets out, and he name checks Gregory in doing this and says, no, actually, we can do this. We can do it so well. We can draw as much as anything else. And then as well, there's a sort of loaded nature of an Ezekiel commentary of all things coming from Saint-Victor, because supposedly it was founded in about 1112 by William of Champeaux, who was head of the cathedral school at Notre Dame. And Abelard, the great self-advertising Abelard, tells us that he ridiculed William when he was in the school because Abelard was challenged to write a commentary on Ezekiel, the most difficult of all commentaries to write. And William was so ashamed and embarrassed that his student was able to do it that he left his post and then set up Saint-Victor. So, I mean, it's Abelard, who knows?
But yeah, according to the student.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, we have one side of this. So, take that with a pinch of salt, certainly. And Abelard writing in his History of Calamities, so it's definitely inflected. Even if it's true or not, it doesn't matter because Abelard, it's out there anyway at this point. Richard is writing probably in the 1160s, 1170s, so quite a bit after that. Yeah, there's a lot of baggage with Ezekiel when it comes to Saint-Victor and Gregory and the 12th century.
Well, they get the last laugh at Saint-Victor anyway, because Richard ends up in the Paradiso, which is the who's who of the Middle Ages.
Exactly, yeah, absolutely, along with Isidore and Bede, I think, as far as I remember. So good company as well.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe this is a good time to talk a little bit about Richard, in that we shouldn't forget about him. This isn't the only thing that he's done in his lifetime. He ends up in the Paradiso, not for these architectural drawings, but for other things. So maybe we should just take a second to say who Richard is and what his legacy is.
Yeah, I mean, he was a Scottish theologian that probably went to Saint-Victor relatively young, maybe around 1140, 41. Whether he knew Hugh of Saint-Victor and met him in person or not is a bit of a fraught issue. He probably didn't to a degree, but he was certainly heavily influenced by him and stayed in Saint-Victor once he got there. But he's mainly known for his mystical writing, not his historical work. He writes the Benjamin Mayer, he writes about the tabernacle. So he's interested in the relationship between allegory and history, but he's primarily known as I would say, as a mystical writer. And the sort of translations of his work certainly focus on his mystical work rather than anything else. He writes polemic. He writes against his Andrew of Saint-Victor, who in his De Emanuele, accusing Andrew of focusing too much on Jewish interpretations of scripture and sacrificing a sort of Christological center within his own commentaries. But it's clear from De Vision Ezekiel, so Ezekiel's vision, which is the work that includes the drawings, that he's influenced by Jewish practices, and we would expect that at Saint Victor. And we know that somebody like Hugh is talking to rabbinic scholars as well. And I suspect Richard is doing the same. But I don't have proof of that, so maybe don't quote me on that. Well, you can quote. It's on the record. I think I've said it before elsewhere anyway, so I can say that. But there's clearly a rabbinic element to Richard's historical work as much as anything else.
Yeah, you do say that in the book, so I think you're tied to it.
Thank you.
Well, I think it's important to talk about the other work that he's doing, because this school at Saint Victor is talking about getting back to the original, always back to the original. And what's kind of interesting as you're talking about this, building the actual structure so that we can understand it in allegorical terms, is interesting because in the book you talk a lot about Hugh, especially thinking about history being the foundation on which we can build other things. And it makes me think a lot about reconstructive archaeology in our community, where people are like, we can't actually understand how to cook this in a pot unless we actually cook it in a pot. And from there, we can make our speculations. It's kind of interesting, I think, to see that echo.
It's one of the fascinating things about focusing on the 12th century is these sorts of ideas and conversations seems to crop up more and more. And it may be because we have more evidence from the 12th century, but you have somebody like, I think I opened the book with Hugh walking down to the Seine and looking at the keels of the boats on the Seine and him making the connection between the curved nature of the keel and Noah's Ark. And traditionally up to that point, Noah's Ark was thought probably to be a sort of rectangular structure. But Hugh's looking at these boats and thinking, well, that doesn't quite work, really, is it? Because the boats will just fall over. And to me, that's fascinating, right? Because you're working from observation to theory. And the theory is not provable in the sense that Richard or Hugh can't go back, and ask Noah, well, why did you do this? Or what did this look like? And, there's the description of Noah's Ark is really very short, but he sort of infers a reality based on his own observations and works from that basis. And to me, that's really quite extraordinary. It's quite brilliant, really, isn't it? It seems so natural to do that, but it's like he's learned to do it or developed it in his own way. And a part of his legacy is this focus on the evidence of your eyes. He called creation a second scripture because you can use it to understand God. Okay, the Bible can do that, but God created creation as well. And you can start with there and move to a better understanding of the world and to God through observation and through the exegesis of the material reality. And it's not even a jump for Hugh. It's so consistent in his own mind. I'm a huge fan of Hugh. Obviously, I write about Richard, but you never get tired of reading Hugh's work. He's a real teacher. And some of the early images of him is as a teacher. And he describes himself almost as a teacher, talking to his brothers. And the school of Saint Victor was an open school. So, you could walk in and get taught by one of the most brilliant men of the 12th century. And he's got fingers on so many pies, with Bernard of Clairvaux is there. Abelard is going around causing trouble. And Hugh is not quite in the center of that, but he's sort of inhabiting that world and still teaching and still working and still thinking about these ideas. And to me, that's one of the beauties of working in this century.
Well, it's an important point to make, because one of the things that is clear in your book is that there are always these discussions going on. And it's almost a joke to hear people talk about medieval people not being sophisticated, because the amount of sophistication that goes into these theological arguments, like how many angels can fit on the head of a pin, like it is so detailed, so structured. These arguments make so much sense. And it's important to bring up the point that you're making, where say you're Hugh of Saint Victor and you're looking at the Seine and you're like, oh no, this does not look like what everyone has said about the Bible. Like this is a very important spiritual moment because of the way that you're interpreting what's literally in there. Is it literally possible? And that can create a spiritual crisis. So it's an important point to be talking about.
And it does. Bernard sort of reacts against that to a degree and focuses on materiality, and Abelard is sort of on the other side of that. But I mean, absolutely, it's very much a center of it. I always think of something like an astrolabe, that it still works, even though the central conceit of it is that the Earth is at the center of the universe. But because based on observation, it still works because it has an internal consistency based on the world around them, even though it's totally off in its understanding and framework for reality. And to me, that's the Middle Ages all over, especially this period where I don't like the idea of relatability. One of the best things about it being a historian is engaging with people it's very difficult to relate to. But in fact, in some ways, there's some points of connection between us and the past because they are consistent with their own particular framework in the same way that we work within ideologies or our own sort of scientific framework. They would say the same. Well, I don't know. Don't want to put words in Hugh's mouth, but I think they would to a degree.
Yes. Well, the idea of creating these architectural drawings, for example, as being a project that has a lot of weight to it, so that it's not just theoretical. It's not just like, oh, this is just an exercise, but well, I mean, this is such a fundamental part of your book that it's in the title, Understanding God's Mind. So can you tell us a little bit about what you mean by that? The stuff that's in the Bible, the visual material stuff that's in the Bible, being a way of understanding God's mind.
Yeah, I remember, like most things I work on, the title came in very late. In fact, I'm not sure I really knew what I was writing until I got the title, in the sense that it strikes me that certainly in the Old Testament and the Hebrew Bible, part of the way that God communicates to his people is through architecture between the tabernacle and the temple, Noah's Ark, Jerusalem, and all of these spaces that he gives these drawings to, in the Latin, carta. He talks about these, that God may, in Genesis, may walk and talk amongst his people. But as he becomes this more distant figure, that sort of indirect relationship between God and his people is mediated through architecture, in the examples that I gave. And it becomes a language that, in a sort of very obvious, well, not obvious, but in a sort of very clear way, at least in my mind, that the plan of the tabernacle and the plan of the temple comes from the mind of God, from a medieval point of view. And they're trying to understand why they look the way they do. There's something important. If this comes directly from heaven and from the mind of God, well, then it has to reflect more important forms than just another building. And trying to understand plans and elevation and actual architectural history, and the fact that the tabernacle and the temple were deemed to be prototypes for the church in a sort of abstract way, an allegorical way, but also clearly in the way the forms relate to one another, is important to them. And I think if it's important to them, it's important to me that, the weight of my interest as a historian is to engage with their interests. And, I might disagree fundamentally with some of them, but it's always interesting, right? That's the point. It's always interesting, and trying to understand their interpretation of a building or a space, and then the representations tell us something about why they do the things that they do and why they think the things that they do. It's all useful as a sort of historical documents to engage with the whole intellectual sphere of architecture in terms of theology, but also the buildings themselves, I think. If that's that, I'm not sure that answers your question, but it's certainly, to me, that's a sort of conversation or the internal dialogue when it came to discovering that title, was certainly the sort of rootedness of architecture within God's interaction with his people.
Well, it's interesting to think about, especially when you think about the fact that these drawings are being created in France by people who hadn't been to the Holy Land, we think. I think that you mentioned in the book that Richard had never been to the Holy Land.
No.
That would have really, I think, informed what he says about this. And so you discuss in the book the fact that some of Richard's drawings have something that he says, this is the Palestinian roofs are like this, but he also draws arches that look like something that he would see every day. And this is actually a big discussion about how to create something like this. And it's akin, I think, for people who have listened to this podcast before, akin to the way that medieval people would draw sometimes the people from the Bible wearing contemporary clothes or ye olde type clothes.
Yes.
So can you tell us about how this works in the architectural drawings? Why and when Richard maybe wanted to make it look like something that people would recognize and see on the daily?
Yeah, I think it aligns with the sort of example that you gave. It sort of not sanctifies, but it makes holy the architecture in front of you, right? It's sort of an architectural iconography in a broader sense by taking this building from the mind of God and translating it to the world around you. And, see that in the Anachronic Renaissance, Nagel and Wood's work on this, and talk quite elegantly about the importance of copies and vital ways in which people engage with the past as substantive examples of the past. And it's, to some reason, I always think as well, if Richard is writing in 1160 or so, it's around when Notre Dame is being built as well, in this. And Saint Denis is there. The new style of Gothic is being built and has been built at this point and is being slowly taken up. Certainly by the time Richard dies, the beginnings of Notre Dame Cathedral, as we know it, is going up. And then in the copies of Richard's work, they don't change it. As far as I remember, you don't see sort of a Gothic update to these buildings. They remain pretty consistent throughout, even up to the 13th and 14th century, and they keep that sort of Romanesqueness, and even the colours in the drawings as well. They separate the different parts, the capitals and the columns and the arches and the coining or the buttresses on either side, which to me is a sort of very Romanesque approach to building. And you see those colours as well, the separation of the different elements in Gothic painting on architecture as well. So I suppose all that is to say that there's a sort of an old and newness to Richard's work. There's the sort of archaising of style to a degree. It's very easy for us to identify that, and I wouldn't want to put that identification of architectural style on Richard. But there's clearly the ways in which the parts are picked out with colour is quite an important part of it as well, and would be reflected in church buildings, certainly. And what does it mean to those buildings? I don't know. I suspect it brings, I would hope anyway, we see within, say, contemporary liturgical commentaries, the attempt to take the physical church in which a person is standing in and use that as a catalyst to memory for other buildings and Christian history. And to me, it's probably because I work on those two areas that these things are connected to me. There's sort of a confirmation bias there to a degree. But to me, that's what's happening, is you see the church in front of you in which you're standing with the colours, and it recalls Ezekiel's temple to a degree, and it sanctifies the space again, or is used to recall Christian past.
Yeah, I think it's important to ask this question because it's not something that he's just kind of like dashed off. It's something that he had to think very carefully about. When someone says, what does the temple look like? You have to think very carefully about what this gatehouse is going to look like. If you said to someone today, like, draw a castle, it's going to have crenellations on it. And, you might not wonder why you're doing that. But if you're drawing something that's supposed to be out of God's head, you have to really carefully think about what this gatehouse is going to look like. So this is a conscious decision. So it's something that is worth thinking about.
Absolutely. And it's so conscious that Richard doesn't finish it. I mean, this is another thing, that the commentary isn't finished. It sort of peters out. The last chapter is not finished. It's just a interlinear gloss. So you just have his notes, essentially, about what he's going to talk about. And the drawings become a little bit more spread out as well as it sort of moves towards the end of the commentary as it stands. And the last drawing is of the altar in the center and the middle atrium. And that is one of the few examples of the different copies of it do deteriorate. It's clear that later copies didn't quite understand what they were looking at. They have some problems of interpretation, which doesn't seem to happen with the other drawings. And it's clear, I think, to a degree, Richard rather runs out of steam when it comes to making this commentary. It's so considered and so thoughtful that he just can't do it anymore. I suspect he moves on to other bigger things at the beginning of the 1170s, such as working with Peter Comester once he moves there.
Well, we've all been there. We've all decided we're going to do something. It's going to be a big project. Like, this is the Canterbury Tales all over, right? I'm going to do it. It's going to be like 100 tales. It's going to be amazing. And you just run out of steam. And I think because these things take so long to create, it probably was a question of having to think so deeply about that, where if you're telling people, I'm working on drawing Ezekiel's vision, you'll have people every day saying, well, what does this look like? And how do you get that? And where does, I'm sure it was exhausting.
As an academic, yes, absolutely. it's not an unrealistic connection. I mean, Saint Victor is a key part of the early University of Paris as much as anything else. He's a sort of proto-academic in many ways, which is maybe why I sort of feel for him. We have the spiritual connection with each other.
Yeah, where you're both like, there is something there, and I know it's there. I can't touch
But
it,
I
but
don't
I'm
have
just,
time. I'm just going to move on to the next thing. Yeah.
yeah, I'll come back to it. I really will. Okay, so I think it's important. I don't think that we've spelled it out. We might have spelled it out before we started recording, but this basically disappeared into the archives. People didn't really think of it as being an important contribution to architectural history, kind of just
Yeah.
got shuffled aside. So, can you tell us a little bit about why you decided to bring this forward and put this in a space where we're talking about architecture? Why is this an important part of that history?
So it would have been reasonably well known within histories of theology and biblical commentary. Beryl Smalley and my supervisor Leslie Smith as well, who sort of knew this work as well. But my undergraduate was an art and architectural historian and had sort of done another major in theology. And so it made sense to me to sort of make these connections. And it's, as I said before, that as an undergraduate, I was told there's no real thing as medieval architecture drawing. That it does come along later. We see clear examples of it at the end of the 13th century. Villard d'Ancourt's portfolio at the beginning of the 13th century. But it's clear you can't build Durham Cathedral without some way of representing it or some sort of visuality to it. But those drawings just don't exist. They're not there. It's not for lack of looking. They're just not there. And to me, then, I saw these. I'd seen them in an article. I think it was in Jester. So it wasn't just me doing it. There was other people were thinking about them. But it fascinated me to try and relate a theological text into a different field, such as architectural history, and do it in a way that was meaningful and useful to architectural historians to demonstrate that there is a visual language of architecture in the 12th century, even though we don't have examples of it on the building sites. We have it in works that the patrons would know. And that's, I think, the key thing. We want a sort of bottom-up history of architectural history from mason foundation pours or upward, but I just don't think it's there. But what we can do is talk about the patrons and the types and the ways in which they understood there to be ways and methods of representing architecture. And that, is there. They're reading theology. Richard is sub-prior of Saint Victor. So he's working and certainly talking to masons in the never-ending building site that was any medieval monastery. Now, I'm not saying that Richard has sort of taken this idea for drawings from the Masons and said, well, that's a good idea, and then sort of, put them into his own commentary. That's probably not what's happening. But it's clear there is a common ground, I suspect, between those two social and intellectual class gulfs, that is the cloister and the building site. And there is a common language of architecture and certainly ways of representing that could be comprehensible and comprehended by both parties, by masons and patrons. But finding those is there. I think there's probably more examples there. We see it slightly earlier in, let's say, liturgical. There's the Amiens manuscript from the 11th century, which talks about the dedication of the church, and it's a plan of a church with the cross, the Latin and the Greek cross on the floor, and sort of commentary about what you do. This was a Sangal plan. They are there. They are thinking about architecture. We've just been looking in the wrong place because so much of architectural history has been dominated by early modernists. And they have a sort of wealth of sources that we just don't have. And so you can't translate those approaches onto certainly the 12th century. And so we have to change those approaches and look and be a bit more imaginative about where we look for these things. And that's pretty much all I've done. Part of it's just happy accidents as well. Friends and colleagues, they'll see something and go, oh, look at this, Karl, and send me photographs and get surreptitious sort of hidden photographs in museums or something. You're not allowed to take photographs. Go, look, here's a picture of a building, Karl, look at this. Yeah, this is sort of the way you do it. All research is to a greater or lesser degree happy accidents. And then you sort of work through what you have. You get luckier the harder you work, but you still require a little bit of luck when it comes to coming across these things. I suspect there's more out there as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, if this is your field, you got to hope that there's going to be more stuff out there. But it is, again, reminiscent of what we're talking about, this community at Saint Victor, where you have people who are pushing for and against, or saying, look at this, or just making their observations. Like, none of the scholarship is possible in isolation. It all comes out of community. And this is,
Yeah.
we were talking before we turned on the microphones about this as being an exciting time for medieval studies because of the way that we can cross lines and borders and find stuff that's been siloed out into other fields. So like this magical combination that you have of theology and architecture, it's what makes this possible.
Yeah, and it's getting easier to have those conversations in many ways. The sort of interdisciplinary dividends pay off in many ways within the sort of infrastructure of universities and the ways in which we can have, conversations in corridors. I was in York for a couple of years and they had this medieval center there, and you'd bump into people and go, "Oh, what are you working on?" And then you'd have an interesting conversation about these. And these sorts of conversations are easier in the very practical sense, but also easier in the more abstract, sort of high level sense as well. And I said, yeah, totally agree. It's a great time. There's sector wide pressures, of course, but in terms of the intellectual world of medieval studies more generally, it's a very exciting time to be working.
Well, I'm hoping that this podcast, speaking with you, will inspire more people to look in different places to find what they want. If they want to know more about the material world, maybe they will look in theological texts, because there's people that are sketching it out right for you. It's right there. Yeah. We just need to look.
Absolutely. There's latest. So Nicholas of Lyra, I'm doing some work on another Victorian associated author, Adam of Dryburgh, another Scottish, who talks about a picture of the tabernacle, which was lost. But he describes in enough detail that you can sort of make it, and people have made a crack of recreating it. There's some good stuff out there. It just all takes time and effort. And, a bit like Richard, have great ideas and hope for the best. And hopefully all those Excel sheets will go away someday and I'll have more time to think about these things.
Yeah, and then in a few centuries, you'll be thought of as a visionary. This is what we're all going for, right?
Absolutely, yes. I'll hold on to that thought.
Thank you so much, Karl, for coming on and telling us all about Richard's work and building these architectural drawings in the 12th century. Thank you.
My pleasure.
To find out more about Karl's work, you can visit his faculty page at the University of Aberdeen. His new book is God's Own Language, Architectural Drawing in the 12th Century. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's up, Peter?
Hey, so do you want to know your horoscope?
Always. It's always interesting, even if it's completely bogus. I love learning about my horoscope.
Of course, people in the Middle Ages did too. So, we have this 15th century horoscope that was done in the Low Countries, and it was great. I came across a translation a while back, and it gives nice advice for everybody. And I know you're a Cancer because you told me.
Yes.
So, and it says for that, Cancer is good. When the sun is in Cancer, it's a good time for fighting and arguing. It's good to travel to the north. It's good to build all things that are associated with water, like windmills or water mills. But don't take medicine for the heart, and don't get married. Don't build new houses, and don't do any job that has anything to do with fire. Don't plant any trees. You may send letters and messages. Letting blood from the arms is good.
I just like the beginning of that. We just leave it with Cancer is good.
I think there's a lot of good advice there.
Yes, definitely.
Don't get married and don't build a new house.
While the sun is in Cancer, which is not necessarily, at that time, right? Is it? I don't know. I don't know anything about astrology. All I know is Cancer is good, and that's what I want to hear.
Well, I'm a Leo, so, it's always good.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So anyways, if you want to read your sign, we have that up on the site. And we also have this really cool study that was done by Michel Sia on queens and gift giving. It focused on late medieval English queens, Margaret of Anjou, Elizabeth of York. And Sia kind of explains how they were using gifts to kind of build alliances and loyalty and reward their followers. So it was pretty cool. And I found like all these kind of cool gifts that they gave. Especially around New Year's, they would give out tons of gold chains and silver plates. Nice. But Margaret of Anjou gave the Archbishop of Canterbury a sapphire. Ooh. And Sia believes it was probably because the Archbishop was feeling unwell around this time. And sapphires had believed to have like medicinal properties.
Mm-hmm.
So it was like a
That's
get
right.
well gift.
Yeah,
So
get well soon. And by the way, here's a very rich gift. Please be my friend. That's what gift
so
giving is all about, right? It's all
that's right.
about
That's
what you
right.
get in return.
That's right. So Elizabeth, on the other hand, like she wanted to give out live deer to other nobles. That was her thing.
That's a gift that keeps on giving.
Yeah, or runs away.
So
So we
true.
have all that. We also have a sale on our Thinkific page, medievalstudies.thinkific.com, because it's Black Friday and everyone else does it. So, but all our courses, the standalone or the 6-week ones, we have a whole bunch now. They're 25% off if you use the code Black Friday, all one word.
That's great. So that people who are getting ready to learn something new can learn it for 25% off. I love how you're like, everyone else is doing it. This is because we are Canadian and Black Friday is not really a part of our culture, although it's becoming part of our culture, right?
Yeah, yeah. I would say it was something like, 10, 15 years ago, it was something we heard of and it was like, oh, that's cute, right? Like, I'll
Mhm.
wait till Boxing Day for our sales.
Yeah. But now
But
you're going to ride that wave and bring savings to everybody. I know a lot of people listening are American. So, hey, happy Black Friday in that you get 25% off courses at Medieval Studies.
indeed, indeed. So, hey, how's your social media game going?
It's rebuilding. So I have been really quiet on social media for quite a long time because I'm really a person who does textual stuff better than visual stuff. So I had like sort of receded from X a little bit. I've
Mm.
been doing a lot of stuff on Instagram. And by a lot, I mean like the only stuff I have been doing was on Instagram, although I'm not particularly great at that. But I hopped on the Blue Sky train last year, but at the time it was quite buggy. So I didn't spend much time there. But I got back on it just a couple weeks ago and I am enjoying this new community that is building up on Blue Sky. So I actually retreated from X, RIP Twitter, because it was just not the place for me anymore. I didn't feel great there. So I've moved over to Blue Sky. I'm also on Instagram. I'm like
Mm.
never on TikTok. I should probably take that down because I think I'm too old and don't have enough
I,
energy for that.
I
But
really
if
want to see some dances from you on TikTok.
it's never going to happen. So if you want to find me on Blue Sky, follow me there. My handle is the same as it is everywhere else, which is 5MIN Medievalist. You're
Yeah,
there
and
too, right?
we're on there at Medievalists, and yeah, we just posted this piece on the Nubian clothing that was recreated by researchers, and that went viral. And I was really happy to see that. Like a lot of people really love that.
Mhm.
But yeah, I have some help with my social media game, so we're pretty consistent in posting stuff, including creating like little videos and stuff.
Yeah. So Peter has been much more active on social media than I have. But you can find both medievalist.net and me on Blue Sky now. So if that is your jam, check it out. It is now, it used to be invitation only, but now anyone can join there. So yeah, we will see you on Blue Sky.
And see you next week on the podcast.
Thanks, Peter.
Thanks.
Thank you, as always, to all of you who support this podcast through letting the ads play through, spreading the word, proudly wearing a 5-minute medievalist shirt from tpublic.com, or signing up at patreon.com. My work just wouldn't be possible without your support, so thank you. If you'd like to become a patron to help me keep the awesome medieval content coming, please visit patreon.com/medievalists. For everything from blueprints to shoe prints, follow medievalists.net on Facebook or X at Medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulski, across social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5-Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores, where you can get hold of Chivalry and Courtesy, Medieval Manners for a Modern World, now out in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Guy Frog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself an amazing day.